"I don't mind Harry. It's Meghan." 7 words on live television, and the room seemed to freeze. Within minutes, clips spread everywhere, and people started debating what had really been meant. But most people watching missed something important. According to the way the story was being framed,
and Harry introducing his children to England. It ain't going to be like that. And there's a long way to go before them to the wolves, who actually was not prepared to tell the truth on their behalf. I mean, it's complete fiction.
Tom Bower's attention had already moved somewhere else entirely. The discussion wasn't only about Meghan anymore. It had shifted toward questions around the Sussex family and public conversations surrounding private details that stretched from California all the way to Buckingham Palace. Supporters of Bower's work argued that what he was building went beyond gossip and tabloid headlines. They pointed to interviews, records, and reporting that they believed showed a bigger pattern. Some people later compared the scale of the discussion to earlier headline moments, including the Oprah interview, saying those moments suddenly looked less shocking in comparison. One thing that kept getting attention was not just what was being said, but what wasn't being said. Public responses stayed limited. Some saw that as a smart move. Others thought it raised even more questions. Either way, the silence became part of the story. But before getting into Harry and Meghan, people who follow Bower's work often point to something else first. Not what he says about people. What sometimes happens after his books and investigations start getting attention. Robert Maxwell was once one of the biggest names in media. He had influence, business power, publishing reach, and strong political connections. When Bower began investigating him, accounts from that period described a serious clash. There were public disputes, legal pressure, and challenges surrounding the reporting. Then, in 1991, Maxwell died after falling from his yacht in circumstances that received major public attention and discussion. After his death, his business empire collapsed, and financial problems became widely reported. Many workers were affected. To observers looking back, the attempts to fight the attention didn't stop the story from growing. Richard Branson took a different path. He challenged Bower through legal action connected to disagreements over how his image and business story were presented. The dispute became public and brought even more coverage. Then there was Conrad Black. He had influence across newspapers in more than one country and connections at the highest levels. To critics, he represented a world where powerful people sometimes seemed to believe different rules applied to them. That reputation kept attention locked on every move and every headline. Bower's reporting was presented piece by piece, source by source, document by document. In the case of Conrad Black, public legal proceedings eventually led to conviction and prison, and major business changes followed afterward.
He, Von Bower, has made a career out of constructing ever more elaborate theories about people he does not know and
to people who follow Bower's work, that history became part of a larger pattern. The argument people make isn't subtle. It's that the subjects connected to these investigations often had huge advantages. More money, more lawyers, better connections. Public relations teams built to control headlines and shape public opinion. Many seemed confident they could push back hard enough to make stories disappear. Again and again, public disputes followed. Legal battles, statements, pressure, media campaigns. But supporters of Bower's approach argue that those reactions sometimes created even more attention, instead of shutting conversations down. What separated this kind of reporting, according to that view, was structure. A tabloid headline can disappear fast. One source can fall apart. One rumor can collapse overnight. But long-form investigations are built differently. They rely on interviews, records, timelines, public information, and layers that supporters believe become harder to challenge once released. By the time people realize how much material has been gathered, the debate has often already moved into public view. That's why some observers say, the question stops being whether attention will come, and becomes how people respond once it does. Harry and Meghan were not without influence. They had legal teams, worldwide recognition, media access, and a public image that had developed over years. They had supporters across different countries and a strong platform to tell their own side of events. From the outside, there were reasons to think they were in a strong position. Critics of Bauer's work have argued that his books can rely heavily on interpretation and unauthorized reporting. Supporters argue the opposite and point to the amount of material collected over time. That debate followed every release.
Nothing else but invade their own privacy every hour of the day. And I do think the use of the children is quite reprehensible.
Then came October 31st, 2022. Halloween morning. Good Morning Britain. At first, it looked routine. Another TV appearance. Another discussion about a royal story that had already filled headlines for years. The expectation was simple. Careful opinions. Safe commentary. Nothing unforgettable. Then, Tom Bauer delivered a line that changed the mood. "I don't mind Harry. It's Meghan. Short, direct. No extra performance. No dramatic build-up." For people already following his reporting, that moment felt less like a headline and more like someone signaling that, in his view, the investigation had already been done. The hosts pushed back. That's what live television is built for. Challenge the guest. Test the claim. See whether the person doubles down or changes direction once the pressure shows up. Bauer didn't step back. Instead, he pointed to what he described as 17 specific inaccuracies connected to statements discussed around the Oprah interview. Not broad criticism, not general impressions. He presented them as individual points that, according to his reporting, had been checked against interviews, records, and publicly available information. What stood out to viewers wasn't only the list, it was the delivery. No notes, no hesitation, fast answers. The kind of tone that gives the impression someone has already spent a long time organizing material before speaking publicly. He also made direct comments about Meghan's public image and motivations, expressing his own interpretation of her approach to fame and media attention. Those remarks immediately became the headline. Then the internet did what it always does. Clips spread everywhere. Views climbed fast. By the end of the day, millions had already seen parts of the exchange, and the reaction split almost instantly. One side saw someone saying out loud what they had believed for years. The other side saw the interview as another example of unfair treatment and criticism aimed at the Sussexes. Supporters and critics moved into familiar positions within hours. But depending on which version of the story people followed, something else was happening in the background. According to the way Bauer's work was being discussed, his attention had already moved beyond that television moment. The suggestion from people following the project was that the research process was largely complete. Interviews had been gathered, timelines reviewed, public material organized. Supporters argued the bigger picture was not limited to Meghan's public conduct, disagreements over interviews, or differences between public statements and accounts shared by others. Instead, they believed the reporting had shifted toward questions about family narratives, private life becoming public discussion, and details that were harder to reduce to one simple explanation. That shift changed the tone, because now the focus wasn't framed as one interview or one headline anymore. It moved toward questions surrounding family, public perception, and how stories evolve once private moments become part of worldwide attention. And at the center of those conversations, people started mentioning one name more often than before: Lilibet. By that point, according to people discussing Bauer's reporting, the attention had shifted toward questions that couldn't be settled with one press statement or one legal response. The conversation focused on public interest around names, royal traditions, ceremonies, titles, and the way family moments were introduced to the world. Supporters of Bauer's approach argued that these details created a pattern they believed deserved closer attention. Critics argued that private family decisions were being turned into something larger than they needed to be. Bauer appeared to approach the moment differently. The argument wasn't about winning one television segment or collecting viral clips. To people who followed his work, the appearance felt more like a signal that the reporting process had already reached its conclusion and that public discussion would follow afterward. And when reactions stayed limited, that silence became part of the conversation too. Some observers interpreted the lack of direct response as confidence. Others saw it as a decision not to amplify criticism. Either way, people started looking at what came next instead of what had already been said. Then attention turned to a name. Some names become public symbols. They appear in headlines, interviews, and conversations until they no longer feel private. Others stay personal. Lilibet belonged to that second category. Historically, it has been widely reported that Lilibet was a childhood nickname connected to Queen Elizabeth II, originating from how she pronounced her own name when she was young. Over time, it became associated with close family relationships and was rarely used publicly. Because of that history, many people viewed the name as unusually personal. So when Prince Harry and Meghan announced in June 2021 that they had named their daughter Lilibet Diana Mountbatten Windsor, reactions quickly followed. For some people, it was seen as a tribute and a gesture of connection to family history. For others, questions appeared almost immediately. Public reporting at the time focused on whether the late Queen had been asked beforehand, or whether she had simply been informed of the decision.
I said in 2 words: desperation and failure. Meghan is someone who is desperate for fame. She's desperate.
Paul, Harry and Meghan were threatening to sue people who disagreed and said that wasn't the case, and now this book is saying actually we back the palace on this one, which is...
Different reports and public statements created debate around exactly how those conversations happened. The BBC reported that the Queen had not been asked for permission in advance. Representatives for Harry and Meghan publicly challenged aspects of that reporting and stated that the Queen had been informed before the announcement. That disagreement became the story, because suddenly the discussion wasn't only about a baby's name anymore. It became a public debate about tradition, communication, and who gets to define the meaning behind private family choices once they become global headlines. The reporting around the name controversy didn't disappear. It kept growing. At the center of it were 2 public versions of the same story. One side of the reporting stated that Queen Elizabeth II had not been asked for permission in advance regarding the use of the name Lilibet. Public commentary at the time pointed to palace sources supporting that version. The message being discussed across media coverage was direct. The Queen had been informed, not formally asked. Harry and Meghan's representatives pushed back publicly. Their side stated that the Queen had been consulted before the announcement and that the conversation had been positive. They challenged reporting that suggested the decision had been made without communication. 2 completely different public accounts, both presented with confidence, both connected to people who would be expected to know what happened. For someone known for long-form reporting, this kind of disagreement fit a familiar pattern. Supporters of Bauer's work often describe his process as looking for what sits between competing public stories, statements, timelines, records, interviews, and details that remain consistent across different versions of events. From that perspective, the bigger question wasn't only whether permission had been requested, it was timing. Over the previous year and a half, Harry and Meghan had publicly stepped away from royal duties and spoken openly in interviews about difficult experiences connected to royal life and media attention. Their public message centered on creating distance and building something independent. Then came the announcement of a name closely associated with Queen Elizabeth II's personal history. That contrast became a major talking point. Some observers viewed it as a sincere tribute and a sign that family ties remained important despite public disagreements. Others interpreted it differently. Certain royal commentators and media voices argued that the decision seemed difficult to reconcile with the broader public message of separation from the institution. They questioned whether the symbolism created mixed signals. Public debate kept expanding. Books, Interviews, opinion pieces, and television discussions all added new interpretations. Some defended the choice completely. Others argued it reflected the complicated relationship between personal connection and public positioning. At that point, the discussion was no longer just about a name. It had become a larger argument about identity, family relationships, public narratives, and whether stepping away from an institution also changes the meaning of the traditions that come with it. That tension became the part people kept talking about long after the headlines moved on. The discussion didn't end there. In June 2026, a birthday post appeared on Meghan's Instagram celebrating Lilibet's 5th birthday, with the caption, "Our dream girl, happy 5th birthday, Lily." Comments were restricted. On its own, that wouldn't stand out. Public figures restrict comments for all kinds of reasons, especially when children are involved. But because this family has been under constant public attention for years, even ordinary choices quickly became part of larger conversations. For some people online, the restricted comments meant nothing more than privacy and protection. Others treated it as another moment connected to older debates surrounding public narratives, royal ties, and the attention attached to the name itself. That's the strange thing about stories this visible. Sometimes even small details start carrying meaning, far beyond what they were intended to hold. Then attention shifted back to June 2022, the Platinum Jubilee. 70 years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. One of the biggest royal events in modern history. Global attention moved toward London, toward the palace, and toward a monarchy going through years of intense public scrutiny and change. Prince Harry and Meghan traveled from California with their children. Public reactions formed almost instantly. Some people saw the visit as a family moment and a sign that personal relationships still mattered, despite public disagreements. Others viewed it as a symbolic return during a moment of maximum attention. Images and reporting around family meetings received enormous interest. Coverage focused on generations coming together during a major historical event. To many viewers, those moments felt human and simple despite all the headlines surrounding them. But commentators and royal watchers offered different readings. Some described the timing as meaningful and emotional. Others questioned whether every appearance connected to major royal moments inevitably becomes part of a broader public narrative. That debate kept growing after the Jubilee ended. One point that received attention was that the event happened during the final months of Queen Elizabeth II's life. Looking back afterward, moments from that period naturally carried more emotional weight than they did at the time. As a result, photographs and reporting connected to family meetings during the Jubilee took on added significance. What had originally been covered as a royal visit became remembered by many people as one of the last widely discussed periods where multiple generations of the family were connected in the same public moment. And once history reshaped the context, people started looking at those images differently. Whether that outcome was anticipated is something no one can state with certainty. What can be observed, however, is what followed. After years of public separation from royal duties, Harry and Meghan were later associated with a set of widely circulated photographs connected to Queen Elizabeth II during the Platinum Jubilee period. For supporters, those images represented a rare moment of family connection. For critics, they raised questions about timing and public messaging. At the same time, the line of succession in the British monarchy continued as expected. When King Charles III ascended the throne, titles were updated automatically under established royal protocol. As grandchildren of the monarch, Archie and Lilibet became eligible for prince and princess titles by birthright, according to the rules set out in letters patent. Lilibet, in particular, was therefore entitled to use the style of princess without any formal application or public campaign. That development drew attention because it contrasted with earlier public debates about titles and recognition. Harry and Meghan had previously spoken in interviews about concerns connected to how their children were being discussed within royal structures. including claims raised during the Oprah interview about uncertainty around titles and protection.
By issuing letters patent to give his grandchildren Archie and Lily the Prince and Princess title.
Those comments had already become part of a broader public discussion about the monarchy and fairness within it. Now, however, the formal rules of succession had resulted in a different reality. The title arrived automatically. There was no negotiation required, no announcement campaign, no public request. It simply came into effect. Observers noted that the response from Harry and Meghan's side was minimal in comparison to earlier periods of intense public communication. There was no major statement focusing on the contrast between past concerns and present status. Instead, the change was absorbed quietly into their existing public presence. From a media analysis perspective, some commentators described a consistent pattern over time: strong public criticism of institutional dynamics, alongside continued participation in the outcomes those institutions produce. Then, attention shifted again to another milestone. The christening of Lilibet Diana Mountbatten Windsor took place in California. Unlike traditional royal baptisms held in historic UK locations, this ceremony was private. There were no official royal representatives present, no senior clergy from the Church of England leading a public service, and no formal media pool documenting the event in real time. Details of the ceremony were shared only in limited form afterward. For supporters, this reflected a modern, private approach to family life outside of royal structures. For critics and commentators, it highlighted the ongoing separation between tradition and personal choice. Once again, the discussion was less about a single event and more about the contrast between public institution and private family decisions. And that contrast became the thread people kept returning to. Taken in isolation, a private christening is not unusual. Families make private choices all the time. Not every moment is meant for public view, and there is no requirement for intimate family events to be turned into media spectacles. Even critics of the Sussexes generally acknowledge that point. But in public discourse, these moments rarely exist in isolation. Each event gets connected to earlier statements, earlier interviews, and earlier narratives. Once that happens, meaning starts to build layer by layer. That is why many discussions circle back to March 2021 and the Oprah interview. At the time, it was one of the most widely watched television interviews in modern broadcasting history. Among the most discussed claims was the suggestion that conversations had taken place within the royal family about Archie's future title and how he would be treated within the institution. The interview included references to concerns raised about his status and the broader implications of how he might be received as a child of mixed heritage. That framing immediately became a global talking point. For many viewers, it reframed Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties. It was no longer seen only as a dispute over privacy or press pressure, but as a deeper conflict about trust, belonging, and institutional treatment. The interview was carefully produced and structured, and its messaging was clear enough that it shaped public debate almost instantly. Supporters viewed it as a necessary disclosure of lived experience. Critics argued it presented one side of complex private interactions without full context. Either way, it set a reference point that future events would constantly be measured against. When viewed through that lens, later decisions, such as keeping private ceremonies outside royal institutions, were interpreted in different ways depending on perspective. The christening of Lilibet Diana Mountbatten Windsor in California followed a very different structure from traditional royal baptisms. There were no senior royal representatives present, no public church setting associated with royal tradition, and no official ceremonial coverage. The event was kept private, with limited details shared afterward. For some, that aligned with the couple's stated desire for privacy and independence from royal structures. For others, it stood in contrast to earlier public narratives about identity.
Stay in a royal palace provided by the king himself. We've got the legendary Tom.
Institutional connection and belonging. What made the discussion persist wasn't any single decision on its own. It was the way each moment was added to a larger sequence of public statements and symbolic choices. From that perspective, commentators like Tom Bower did not necessarily treat these events as moral verdicts. Instead, they presented them as data points in a longer pattern of behavior, one that becomes more significant when viewed as a whole, rather than in isolation. And that broader pattern is what kept the debate alive long after each individual moment passed. The argument being made here is about pattern, not isolated moments. Supporters of this interpretation describe a consistent structure in how royal association is handled. When connection to the monarchy offers visibility, legitimacy, or narrative strength, it is embraced publicly. When that same connection requires institutional participation or constraint, it is presented as something to be distanced from. In that framing, individual events like private ceremonies or public appearances are not treated as separate decisions. They are read as part of a broader sequence. Critics of that view argue the opposite, that it takes normal family choices and connects them into a single storyline after the fact. This disagreement sits at the center of almost every discussion involving Harry and Meghan. When Tom Bower's work was released, reactions followed familiar lines. Supporters pointed to interviews, documents, and public records he cited. Critics questioned interpretation, tone, and selection of material. What is clear is that Bower presents his findings as a connected narrative, built from multiple sources over time, rather than isolated claims. In publishing practice, advance copies are typically provided to subjects or their representatives before release. This allows time to review content, identify possible factual disputes, and prepare responses if needed. Harry and Meghan's legal and communications teams had access to that process, as they had in previous high-profile situations involving media coverage. In earlier cases, they had used formal legal action to challenge reporting they believed was inaccurate. One widely reported example was Meghan's legal case against the Mail on Sunday over the publication of a private letter, which resulted in a court ruling in her favor and a required public acknowledgement from the newspaper. That case demonstrated their willingness and ability to engage directly with the legal system when they chose to do so. Against that background, observers noted the lack of an immediate, detailed public response to Bower's claims at the time of release. No comprehensive rebuttal was issued, addressing each allegation point by point. No major coordinated legal challenge was launched in response to the book itself during its initial publication window. Instead, there was a more limited public reaction, focused on general disagreement with certain characterizations. To supporters of Bower's reporting, that absence of detailed counteraction was interpreted as significant. To critics, it reflected a decision not to amplify what they saw as a one-sided narrative. What followed was a familiar media pattern: attention, debate, and division across public opinion. And in that space, the story continued to be shaped less by any single statement, and more by how each side chose to interpret what was left unsaid. What followed, according to observers, was silence. Not absence of meaning, silence with structure. Some legal commentators discussing the situation noted a general principle. When high-profile individuals with strong legal teams choose not to respond in detail to published claims, it is often a strategic decision rather than inaction. In legal terms, a full public rebuttal can sometimes expand exposure, especially if it shifts the matter toward evidentiary dispute. In that context, responding can open the door to discovery processes, where communications, documents, and testimony may be scrutinized under legal standards. For that reason, public silence is sometimes used as a way to avoid escalating a dispute into a formal legal arena. That explanation, however, only covers one side of the reaction. The other silence came from institutions. Buckingham Palace did not issue a detailed public response to the specific claims being circulated around Bower's work. Instead, there was no formal engagement with the allegations, at the level of direct point-by-point rebuttal. For observers familiar with royal communication strategy, that absence was noted. The palace has a long-established pattern of responding selectively to media narratives. In some cases, it has issued statements, corrected reporting, or used briefings to shape context. In other cases, it has chosen not to respond publicly, particularly when officials believe engagement could prolong attention. This is where interpretations diverge. Some commentators argue that silence in institutional settings can reflect a decision that a story does not require amplification. Others argue it can reflect a preference not to engage directly with contentious narratives in public. In discussions around this case, both interpretations were present. At the same time, public debate around Harry and Meghan remained polarized. Supporters of Bauer's reporting emphasized the structure of his sourcing and the consistency of the narrative he presented. Critics questioned framing, selection, and interpretation. What is broadly agreed is that his work is built as a connected narrative rather than isolated claims, drawing on interviews, records, and previously reported material to construct a timeline. In that sense, the impact of the book was not simply about criticism of individuals. It was about how existing public narratives were reorganized when placed into a single consolidated account. Supporters of that view argue that the effect is cumulative. Each earlier event takes on new meaning when placed alongside later ones, shifting the overall interpretation of the story. Critics argue the opposite, that connecting events into a single explanatory framework can overstate relationships between unrelated decisions. Both readings continue to exist in parallel, and between them, the public narrative remains divided, shaped less by any single claim than by how the same set of events is interpreted through different assumptions about intent, context, and evidence. The interview format mattered. 2 chairs, a sympathetic interviewer, a controlled setting where interruptions were minimal and the subjects were given space to speak at length. In that environment, Harry and Meghan presented a clear and emotionally structured account of their experience. The central message, as it was widely understood, was consistent. They felt unprotected within the institution. They believed they were not supported at key moments, and they ultimately chose to step away as a matter of survival and self-preservation. The narrative was personal, and it was effective in reaching a global audience. It also drew on themes that carried strong emotional weight, including family tension, media pressure, and discussions about race and identity within public life. For many viewers, the combination of those elements made the story especially compelling. Supporters saw it as an honest account of lived experience. Critics saw it as a selective framing of complex internal matters. Tom Bauer's approach, as described by his supporters and detractors alike, did not attempt to match that emotional structure. Instead, it focused on sequence and documentation. Rather than building an emotional counter-narrative, his work presents a timeline of decisions and publicly observable events, announcements, interviews, appearances, and changes in role and status. Each is placed in chronological order, with references intended to support the factual basis of the account. From that perspective, the argument is not about emotion, but structure. Supporters of his work argue that when those events are placed side by side, they form a pattern of interaction with the institution that is more complex than a single explanatory narrative. They point to decisions involving public messaging, royal association, ceremonial participation, and private family events that intersect with public symbolism. Critics argue that sequencing events in this way can create the impression of intent where none may exist, and that context can be lost when actions are grouped into a single interpretive framework. Both readings persist in public discussion. What distinguishes Bauer's method, according to those who analyze it, is that it prioritizes documented actions over stated intent. It asks readers to focus less on how events are described by those involved and more on how those events unfolded over time. In that sense, the effect of the work is less about direct contradiction of any single claim, and more about reframing the overall structure of the story being told. And once that structure is in place, it inevitably influences how each individual moment is interpreted afterward. In 2023, Spotify ended its partnership with the Sussexes. The official explanation centered on production output and the challenges of meeting the volume of content originally expected under the deal. At a surface level, that is how most business partnerships end, when expectations are not fully met on either side. But in wider commentary, the decision was also discussed in a broader context: how public narratives intersect with commercial value. The Sussex brand, as it existed in media and entertainment spaces, was closely tied to their public story. Their interviews, documentaries, and public statements formed part of the identity that partners were investing in. When that narrative becomes the subject of ongoing public debate, the commercial calculation naturally changes. Companies begin reassessing audience perception, long-term association, and reputational risk. In that environment, even without formal disputes, projects can slow, shift, or be restructured. Netflix continued its partnership on a different trajectory, with some announced projects progressing and others delayed or developed more quietly. The releases that did occur were widely discussed and then compared by commentators with alternative accounts circulating in books, reporting, and analysis. The result, in industry terms, was not abrupt cancellation, but a gradual reassessment of narrative consistency versus public perception. In entertainment and media industries, that process is often described as credibility management. The way a public figure's projected identity holds up when placed alongside competing interpretations of the same events. Over time, gaps between narrative framing and external commentary can influence how future projects are positioned, marketed, and received. At the same time, the Sussexes have continued to maintain control over their own storytelling channels, including interviews, productions, and published material, reinforcing their perspective to global audiences. Supporters argue this reflects a necessary effort to present their lived experience in their own words. Critics argue it demonstrates how competing narratives continue to shape public interpretation over time. Tom Bauer, for his part, has stated publicly that his work continues and that he is still engaged in ongoing research and reporting. He has also indicated that future publications would continue to apply the same approach of documentation and cross-referencing used in his earlier work. That creates an ongoing tension between narrative production and narrative scrutiny. The central vulnerability, as described by commentators, is not simply disagreement over events, but the exposure of competing frameworks used to interpret them. One framework is built on personal testimony and emotional narrative. The other is built on chronological documentation and external verification. Bauer did. And so we come back to where this story actually sits. Not in a television studio in 2022. Not in a California interview in 2021. Not in centuries-old royal traditions, or formal statements, or carefully managed press briefings. It sits in smaller moments that ended up carrying much larger meaning. A birthday post, a caption, a name, "Our dream girl, happy 5th birthday, Lily." Comments restricted. A 5-year-old child acknowledged on one of the most followed accounts in the world, with public discussion limited by design. For some, that is simply modern privacy in a digital environment that can become overwhelming. For others, it becomes part of a longer conversation about visibility, narrative control, and what remains public versus what is kept behind closed settings. The post itself is simple. The interpretation around it is not, because the broader questions that have followed this story, questions about names, timing, public statements, royal association, and conflicting accounts, have not been definitively resolved in the public space. They have instead been debated, interpreted, and reinterpreted across interviews, books, articles, and commentary, and over time, those pieces have accumulated into a single, contested narrative that different audiences continue to read in completely different ways. For supporters of Tom Bower's approach, that accumulation is the point, a documented sequence of events that forms a pattern when viewed together. For critics, it is a selective framing of complex personal history that depends heavily on interpretation. Both views continue to exist side by side, and neither side has managed to fully close the conversation. As for Bower, his work continues to be discussed, challenged, and referenced. He remains part of the broader media landscape surrounding the monarchy and the Sussexes, with ongoing attention whenever new claims, books, or interviews enter the cycle. And that is what defines this entire story. It does not resolve cleanly. It circulates, reappears, and evolves each time new material enters the public sphere. If you've watched this far, you already know why. Some stories don't end when they are told. They end when no one is left arguing about them, and this one is still being argued. If you want to stay updated as new developments emerge, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter when it arrives. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on this, whether you see it as strategy, misinterpretation, or something more deliberate. The conversation is still unfolding, and if you know someone who thinks this story is finished, send this to them. Because whatever side you land on, one thing is clear: this is not a story that has stopped moving.